It's Monday night, and Mondays in May are for marriages. Welcome to our third session of Love Talk. We're so glad that you've joined us. Susie and I are excited about doing this little series of devotional talks about Dr. Les and Leslie Parrott's Love Talk material, because we really believe it has the potential to help the communication of our marriages so much, because communication truly is the foundation, the lifeblood of how our relationships can be healthier and more as God intended them to be. So we're thankful that you joined us again. And I just wanted to say that I hope that you will take last week's lesson and this week's lesson really seriously into heart, because I think what Drs. Les and Leslie are teaching here in the second and third session is just valuable, incredibly valuable, and that if you will learn what they are teaching and apply it to your relationships, to your marriage, with your spouse, it has the ability to truly improve so many things. And so if you haven't already, I hope you have, but I hope that you have already gone through the chapters for last week. I hope you've done the exercises, and I hope you've sat down together and you've looked at the results of those exercises together, because I think that's what is most critical and most helpful in this study, is that you see how one another behave in their different patterns and styles of communication, what their fear factors are. That's what we looked at last week. So I hope you took the time to do that. And now I hope you've already watched the third video on Right Now Media for Love Talk, and we're going to get into it today. Just to quickly review for last week, we identified our personal fear factor. They taught us that there are four things that often we are looking at, and we don't even really obviously consciously think about it, but we fall into one of these four categories. They call them fear factors, but they're really our emotional safety need, is what they also say. And it's losing time, losing the approval of others, jeopardizing loyalty, or tarnishing my quality reputation. And when we understand what that is in our spouse, and we talked about how mine is the fear of losing time. Mm-hmm. And honey, yours was the
fear of losing the approval of others.
Of other people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think when we come to our conversations and our communication with that understanding of each other's fear factor, it makes a lot of sense, and it helps like when to have conversations, when not to have conversations, why somebody is coming at a conversation a certain way. So that's an important thing to be looking at. And then we combined that key fear factor with our talk styles, which was determined by answering those four questions. How do you tackle problems aggressively or passively? How do you influence your partner with feelings or facts? How do you react to change aggressively or passively? And how you make decisions with feelings or facts. And understanding the way your spouse approaches these topics is very important in helping you take the next step of Love Talk, which we will discuss tonight, which is the secret to emotional connection. And we're going to primarily be talking about chapter 10. If you don't have the materials, I hope that you can download the study guide that we have provided on our website, and the link to that, because that will help lead you through the content. And we will try to kind of walk through the content as well, so that if you don't have the materials, you will still benefit greatly from this discussion. So we're going to get it kicked off with a survey that they talked about at the beginning of chapter 10. It was done by the University of Washington, and it was a study that concluded that satisfaction in marriage is determined by the couple's ratio of positive and negative moments. And they found in this study that a satisfying marriage needs a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative moments. It's an interesting study. So do you agree or disagree with the findings of the study? That's the first question on our study guide. So I'm just going to ask my wife to respond to that. Would you agree or disagree with the findings that say that to have a satisfying marriage, you need to have 5 positive interactions for every negative?
Well, I'll just go kind of with what I feel like the underlying message is there, is that there has to be more positive than negative, and a significant amount more positive than negative.
Right.
And I think that I definitely agree with that. I don't know that we need to count it out, but I think that basically it's like your bucket full of satisfaction. Every negative thing takes things out of that bucket.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot more positive to actually
Yeah.
fill that back up. I think we tend as people to remember the negative so much longer, and it has such a stronger impact on our emotions. So if somebody says something negative to me, probably because I'm a woman as well, but I think it's just humans, not necessarily gender specific.
Right.
But I'm going to remember that negative comment, even if 10 people have told me something positive. I'm going to focus on the negative.
Yeah. No, that's unfortunately true about our human natures, that we are usually down deep in our heart, we're pretty insecure. And so we really, those negative comments are big to us. And so that's why we certainly need more positive than negative to have a satisfying relationship. And so that by itself, I think, is a valuable thing to remember, that we've got to make sure that we are affirming, that we are making sure that our spouses and those that we care about know how much we value them by doing a variety of different things. To, like Susie said, fill that bucket up with positivity, because there's going to be negative things that happen in this world and in our lives. And if that is the primary message that is being conveyed in our marriages, then that's going to be tough. It's going to be real tough. So I think that's an important thing to think about. Well, one of the ways then that Les and Leslie talk about how it is that we can provide more positive messages is we have to learn how to empathize. And I've heard that word a lot. I've actually studied it a little bit, but they kind of come at it from a little bit different way than I've ever heard it described before. And I kind of like the way they're talking about this. They're basically saying that to empathize, you need to both analyze and sympathize. And let me just kind of step back and say the best way I've heard empathy explained is to try and get in another person's shoes. If you can really try to experience what that other person is going through, that having those kinds of conversations can be incredibly valuable to your relationships. And sadly, most of the time we don't. The idea that they're teaching us here is that most people will usually analyze or they will sympathize. They'll do one or the other, but they don't usually do both. And if you don't understand the need to do both, then you'll never get to that level of empathy that is so critical to healthy, growing relationships. And so they talk about this whole, your head and your heart, that your head is the part that analyzes, your heart is the part that sympathizes, and those have to work together for empathy to be at play. So the next question on our study guide says, your spouse brings home a problem. Which are you more likely to do, analyze or sympathize? And why do you believe this is so? So how would you answer that question, honey?
Well, I am definitely going to sympathize more. That's just, I have a big heart, and until I read that chapter, I've always thought I was an empathetic person.
Right.
But the distinction that I took away from what they said was that if you are truly empathizing, if you sympathize, you say, okay, how would I feel if this was happening to me? I'm good at that. Yeah. I can do that. But to empathize says, okay, you may not actually respond that way.
Right.
So don't project what my reaction is to that situation onto you.
Oh, right.
But rather, to me, the analytical part that I would have to adapt to is, okay, yeah, I can feel what I would feel like. But what are you feeling? How can I anticipate, based on how I know you, how you are going to feel, or to just come out and ask and say, how are you feeling? I can imagine, not to assume that the way that I would react is the way that you would react.
Right. And I think that's key to this. And if we want to improve our relationships, meaning I need to improve the way we communicate, that means I need to be willing to accept the reality that we are going to look at things differently. And to me, that's really what empathy is about, is being willing to look at things in a way that might be natural to me, because I certainly come to a problem with a much more analytical mindset. So that's where my wife and I are different on that. But see, the key would be that God would intend to use those differences to improve our relationship. But for that to happen, we have to both understand the value of each other's perspective. And I'm afraid that far too few marriages actually get to that point where they realize that. They just, like Sue said, well, it's my perspective. I get it. I understand. And it would just make more sense if, well, doesn't everybody look at it that way? Well, the reality is we don't. And I think when we really stop to think about it, in a marriage, it's good that we don't think alike. It's good that we aren't both exactly the same way. If we were, that would be limiting in what we could actually accomplish. And so to appreciate that, yeah, I'm not going to understand the sympathetic side as quickly because I'm more analytical, you do. And so if I'm willing to have the conversation to understand the sympathetic side, and my wife is willing to have the conversation to understand the analytic side, we're going to be better off at the end. And that's what really empathy is all about. So we're going to really kind of dig deep on this today, if we can, and kind of help you find that application of how can you do that? How can you truly empathize with each other in your relationship? And exercise 10 starts that process. Now, if you don't have the materials, I'll just briefly describe what exercise 10 is about. First of all, it's helping you figure out, which probably you already do. You probably already know if you're more analytical or more sympathetic. But if you're curious, because we're usually not 100% one and 0 of the other. And so the exercises, the two main exercises in exercise 10 is to help you find out, well, how much of your head do you usually use? And how much of your heart do you normally use? So for example, for me, the exercises, in the first one, they're looking at how much of your head, and it's a 1 to 15 ranking. And then the sympathetic is a 1 to 100 ranking. And so kind of gives you an idea of where you stand. Excuse me, I said that backwards. The first one has to do more with your heart. And the second one, so the 1 to 15 is how much you use your heart. And the 1 to 100 is how much you use your head. And on the heart one, 1 to 15, I got a 7. So right in the middle. So it means that I don't use my heart, but I'm not pegged out on that one. What did you get on that one, honey?
14.
14, yes indeed. 14 out of 15 means that Sue's really, when she looks at a situation, a problem, whatever, she's going to look at it through the lens of sympathy. Then on the other side, out of 100, if you were to be very, very analytical, then you would rank, 90 to 100. I happen to rank 67 in that. What did you rank on that one?
43.
43. So certainly, and we knew that already. We knew that Suze was more sympathetic and I was more analytical. But it also shows, again, that you're not 100%. So you have the capacity to be analytical if you're more sympathetic. Or you have the ability to be sympathetic if you're more analytical. So it is possible, and I think really when you begin to understand this, most of the time we don't talk about this, so we never figure this out. So that's what this is. So the study is so valuable to help us see that in our relationships. So in that exercise, I hope if you have the materials that you'll do that. But the bottom line is that you stop to think that through. One of you is probably more sympathetic. One of you is probably more analytical. And to empathize with one another, you have to capitalize on both of those strengths. The next question says, in what ways have you seen the head and heart aspects of empathy play a role in your marriage? Can you think of a way, honey, that's played a role in our marriage?
Well, it just plays out in everything we do. I just react to things more with my heart. I tend to sympathize. I'm going to react based more on feelings than thinking things through. Okay, so I will say that I tend to peg you as more the realist or you're always questioning sometimes questioning my emotional response to something because you try to bring the analytical part into it, like, what sense does this make? Which is really good for me, because otherwise I'm going to just go off the deep end in terms of reacting based on my feelings. I don't always stop and think about the rational part of it. I'm going to make a decision based on the feeling part of that. And we've had that come into play several times throughout our marriage. And so I actually need you to help rein in my tend to react emotionally. Whereas on the other hand, I know that there have been times when you've been looking at a situation really analytically, and I will bring the feeling part into it, and I've watched you go, oh, I didn't think about it that way.
Yeah, absolutely, all the time. And so I hope you can see the value of empathy, but you have to be willing to do it. You have to be willing to take the time, and I guess that's what it is again. We have to be willing to set aside all the distractions and the selfish motivations in life and take the time to communicate, because empathizing with one another can't happen in a short 15-second conversation. You have to take the time to have that conversation to see it from both sides. And that's what empathy takes. Okay, so then in the next exercise 11, it has a series of questions, and I'm just going to go ahead and go through these real quick because I think they would be helpful in you thinking through, how do I apply this now? How do I day to day use empathy with my spouse or those that I care about on a regular basis? So one of the things says to help you get into another person's skin, I've heard that said, or into their shoes and experience what life is like for them. That helps you empathize. And so the first question, exercise 11, says, what time would you get up in the morning if you were the other person? What time would you get up in the morning, and how did you sleep? What would your morning mood look like, and why? That's just a good starting point to start thinking about the other person. The second question is, how long would it take you to get ready for the day? Would you spend more or less time in front of the mirror? What would you wear? That's just kind of an interesting, fun question to consider if you were to be living in the shoes of the other person. Third question says, when would you leave the house if you left at all? What would your activities be throughout the day? Okay. Question 4 says, what would you worry about in a typical day? Now we're getting to some needs. What would be your likely stress points? Wow. I'd never thought about that before. I'd never thought about thinking through my wife's day from the perspective of what is stressing her out, and how valuable that would be, and how helpful to empathize with one another in a conversation if we were considering that. The fifth question says, what would bring you the greatest joy or satisfaction during a typical day? And again, you're thinking that through for your spouse. So question 6 says, would you have different financial responsibilities or pressures? Usually, in most marriages, one or the two kind of bears the responsibility of paying the bills and keeping track of the family's finances. So what if you're the one that doesn't do that? Have you ever really stopped to think about the stress and the pressure that might put on your spouse, because they are the ones that's watching the bottom line. They are the one that's watching us spend faster than we are bringing it in. And oftentimes we don't have a lot of conversations about that to share the burden. So there's only one taking care of that. So that's a good way you can empathize with one another. Question 7 says, would you eat differently? Exercise? Would you be more or less concerned about your physical appearance? Interesting question to think through. Number 8, would you feel more or less self-assured? Wow. Now we're starting to get deep. Now we're starting to get personal. You know, it helps us to really see life through the lens of our spouse. Number 9, how would you feel toward the end of the day as you're getting ready for dinner? What would be on your mind? And then the last question asks, and how would you feel about your partner? That would be you. What would you want most from your partner? How would you communicate with your partner? I think that is a great exercise to think through, but I hope you won't just think that through by yourself, but you will think it through together. That you'll talk about kind of how you see that and kind of check in with each other, because I think the answers to those questions would help you empathize better with your spouse. So Empathy is a primary tool for tapping into your partner's top emotional safety need, which we already talked about last week, our fear factor. How could you use your head and your heart to better understand your spouse's emotional fear factor? How would you probably answer that question, honey? How could you use your head and or your heart to better understand your spouse's emotional fear factor? So in my case, my fear factor is
Time. So it's understanding that when I may feel like you're being impatient, and then that hits my heart, to understand, no, you're feeling a whole lot of pressure to get certain things done, and to realize that it's not a personal attack on me, but that is what is most important to you,
right.
And you're not trying to hurt me in any way. You are just feeling the pressure. Going through the exercise of trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes was really valuable, because I was like, it helped me to understand a few things, like the pressure that you probably feel in certain aspects of what you have to do on a daily basis, and the time constraints that are there, not just because of your own personality, but also because of what you do. And so just, I think, being aware of that, and not taking, since I am more heart-based, not taking things so personally. And since approval is my thing, trying to not take things so personally, and understand, using more of that analytics to say, okay, your heart is reacting, but think of it from his perspective. He's not trying to be hurtful.
I think that's a great way to express or to describe empathy, because I think you hit on something really valuable there. We often probably take things that happen, interactions with our spouse, way too seriously, and we take them to heart when it's unnecessary. I mean, I guess it's normal, it's reasonable for us to do it that way. But it's not helpful, because like the case of us where my fear factor is losing time, Suze is right. There are things that I probably say and do that have nothing to do with her. It is not a personal attack. It may be insensitive, I'll admit it, because I am thinking more about what I feel I've got to get accomplished than her needs, but that's what's important about empathy. Now that I understand that her fear factor is losing the approval of others, then that means for her, the quick conversation, the having to move on, means nothing to her, because it takes time to make sure that we're okay. There has to be some conversation about what's going on in our lives, so that she can check in and make sure that we're doing okay, that she has my approval. I often completely overlook that, because I feel like, I told you on our wedding day that you have my approval, and just assume that that's the case until I tell you otherwise. And that's not good. And so that's why this is so critical, to be able to empathize with each other, and use both our head and our heart to that advantage. Okay, there's an interesting verse, Romans 12:15, that has a lot to say about empathy. It's a very simple verse. It says, "Be happy with those who are happy, and weep with those who weep." In what ways does this verse relate to our discussion on empathy?
Well, because you are trying to put yourself in the shoes of the other person.
Right.
I was still coming back to that distinction, and I see almost that verse again as sympathy, and the way that you bring in the empathy is, again, you don't expect them to be happy in the same way or for the same reason that you are.
Right.
The analytic part, I'm really good at sympathizing with others. I feel their pain, or what I assume their pain would be based on my interpretation of what I would feel. The part that I really have to work on is understanding that may not be what they're thinking and they're feeling.
Right.
I can understand the pain that they could be feeling, or the joy that they could be feeling.
Right.
But I need to go a step further and say, well, that may not be exactly what they're feeling, and I need to give them I need to not push my reaction onto them.
Well, that's empathy, right? That is exactly it. And I think there's a lot of implications to that verse. Obviously, it is meant to teach us that life is meant to be done together. That God did not create us to live apart, to live lonely, isolated lives. That we're to do this together, and we're supposed to share all of life. That's what I read in that verse. Be happy with those who are happy, weep with those who weep. That means I'm going to engage at an empathetic level at all emotions that happen in life and all circumstances and all things that we go through, that I'm going to be willing to engage in that with other people. Now, as we've already talked about, but I think it bears repeating again, there are going to be some emotional circumstances that happen in life that I'm not going to just immediately be at ease and comfortable with, and vice versa. We have to be willing to at least try. Am I ever going to be able to walk in my wife's shoes? Well, of course not. She in mine? Of course not. But I have to be willing to try to see things from somebody else's point of view, because that reminds me of something else we've been told to do as Christians, and that's to be humble. Humility is I'm willing to look at things from somebody else's point of view. If all I ever think is my point of view is right, well, that's prideful. That's not humility. And so empathy is really, in my mind, the practical action step of humility. That life isn't all about me, and I'm going to help other people know that they are valuable, that they are important, and I do that by empathizing with them. And to have those conversations is critical. But again, it takes some time. You've got to set aside a lot of distractions to be able to live this way with one another. I remember hearing a saying years ago, and I looked it up this week. The saying is, a hurt shared is cut in half, and a joy shared is doubled. And I looked it up this week to see who was the one that quoted that, who said that, and I found out that it's an old Swedish proverb is what it is. Let me say that again. A hurt shared is cut in half, and a joy shared is doubled. And I think we really know that's true. We know that if we will live our life with one another in all circumstances, that is, I mean, when you have something good happen to you, what's the first thing you want to do?
You want to tell somebody.
You want to tell somebody. You want to share it. Now, let's be honest, sometimes when we are hurt, that isn't our first inclination. We don't want to go find somebody to share that with. And so that is why having constant, regular, growing, healthy relationships are important, so that that other person in your life can go, uh-oh, there's something wrong. This person, this one I love is hurting. And I need to be willing to, even if they're not really wanting to share that, I need to be willing to enter into that with them, even if it's just simply being there with them in the midst of that hurt and pain, and allowing them to live it with them and let them live it at their pace. That is incredibly empathetic. But making sure that they know that you're there and you're not just walking away because times are tough or you don't know what to say or whatever that is. Presence is huge at a time like that. So how do you think empathizing with your spouse would improve your communication? Just kind of wrapping this up in general. We're talking about communication. What would empathy ultimately really do to help improve our communication?
Well, I think it would help to, I don't remember what the phrase is that they use in the book, but basically it would help to reduce the number of conflicts in communication. In other words, is if we're willing to empathize and actually stop for a moment and think about the other person instead of react.
Yeah.
Because I think it's just way too easy to get set into our little ruts and make assumptions based on what we think we know rather than actually stopping and investigating. Yeah. And I think that's an important piece to empathy, is that even when somebody, let's just say it's somebody that you don't even know well, and they just all of a sudden react in a very strange way or hurtful way or harmful way or whatever, I think our first human reaction is to criticize or to be judgmental.
I think what we have to do instead is we have to go, now wait a second. Why did that person, that's not normal. That's out of character. Well, because there was a reason.
What's going on in their life?
There's something going on underneath the surface that caused that. And I think when we're willing to humble ourselves and step back for a second and realize that hurt people, that gives us a little bit of empathy to then slow our reaction, not be so negative, and then be willing to be more positive with that person at that moment, which is ultimately, even if it doesn't happen that moment, it is certainly going to pay much higher dividends in healthy relationships and helping other people if you empathize with them, especially I think at those moments where, they are acting out of character and their anger got to them, and they're saying things and doing things that are hurtful. Stop, don't escalate the situation. Turn it around. And I found that helpful in my life by just realizing, after talking with an awful lot of people as a pastor, how many things are behind the scenes in our lives. When we have an average conversation with somebody at the grocery store, over the fence, our neighbor, we have no idea what has gone on in their past. And yet they may say some things that you're like, what on earth? That is craziness. Well, if you'd lived their life, you might not find it so crazy. And so that's what empathy is all about. Last question. In what ways has your spouse helped you grow as a person since you've been married?
Well, in a lot of ways. I think our personalities, it's very interesting because we have a lot in common in how we approach, especially like work and different things like that. But we are also very different, and I think we do complement one another. You have been just a rock for me. I mean, you've always been there when I tend to get really emotional about something. You allow me to do that, but you also then bring me back and help me to think about the more realistic, rational approach to things. And there have been certain times that I have desperately needed that. And when my brother was sick, that was a real important time that you were there for me, and your rational thinking helped keep me from going off the emotional deep end. And that's just one example of how those things have helped me throughout the years that we've been married.
And the same is true, the other way. Even before I was a pastor, and I can look back now and I can see it because hindsight's 20/20. But my wife was helping me prepare to be a pastor before I was a pastor. She was helping me to see in a more sympathetic lens what people go through, and that was getting me ready to be able to sympathize and empathize with other people that I was going to be ministering to later in my life. And so the key and the reason I asked that question here at the end is I wanted to bring this back to hopefully the perspective that God brought us together for an incredibly valuable purpose. And that is to not have opposite traits, in a sense, your head and your heart, so that there's constantly a conflict. No. I mean, yes, that can happen in a broken and fallen world. But the real purpose of it was to complement one another so that you would both be better. And that's the goal. And that's what we're talking about in this series, this session today, is how can we be better? And the way we can better communicate with one another is by being willing to be empathetic. So I put down just for you, what does it look like to mourn with your spouse? What would that look like? You've probably had to do it already. What would it look like to do it from a more empathetic standpoint? What does it look like when you rejoice with him or her? So again, what would that look like if you did it from a more empathetic standpoint? And so I hope that you will, if you haven't already, read chapters 10 and 11, and then do exercises 10 through 12, and then talk about them together, and then intentionally try this week. I want to throw out this challenge. Throughout the week, as you see your spouse going through their routine, which, yes, may be different right now than normal, but it doesn't matter. as you see them going about whatever routine that is, try to put yourself in their shoes and think, boy, what would I be thinking? What would I be dealing with right now? What stresses might my mind be going through? I think that would be huge for us to help in our communication. And then what could you do to empathize with him or her this week? That's what our goal, that's what our homework is, if you will, is to be better communicators through empathy. Well, I really hope that this session will be incredibly valuable to you because I believe as I've gone through and studied this material, it's some of the best communication building material I've ever been a part of or had the opportunity to pass on to other people. And so I hope that you will take it to heart, and I hope that this will really truly help you begin to improve your love talk. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week.